remember how we have a field for the average rating on each tour document? Well, up until this point, that field doesn't really hold any meaningful data, does it? But so, let's now actually change that and calculate average ratings in this lecture. So, storing a summary of a related dataset on the main dataset is actually a very popular technique in data modeling that I hadn't actually mentioned yet. And this technique can actually be really helpful in order to prevent constant queries of the related dataset. So in our application, a great example of this technique is to store the average rating and the number of ratings on each tour, so that we don't have to query the reviews and calculate that average each time that we query for all the tours, okay? For example, that could become very useful for a tour overview page in our front end, where we do really not want to display all the reviews, but still want to show a summary of these reviews, like for example, the number of ratings and the average. And actually, we already have the fields for that in our tour schema. So right here in the beginning, I think, so we have the ratings average and ratings quantity right here. But right now, they're only just some numbers. And of course, they are not the actual average and the number of ratings, because we never really calculated that at any point in our application. But that's exactly what we're going to change in this video. So right now, we're going to calculate the average rating and also the number of ratings of a tour each time that a new review is added to that tour, or also when a review is updated or deleted. Because that's exactly the situations when the number or the average might change, right? So how are we actually going to implement this? Well, back here in the review model, we're going to create a new function which will take in a tour ID and calculate the average rating and the number of ratings that exist in our collection for that exact tour. Then in the end, the function will even update the corresponding tour document. Then, in order to use that function, we will use middleware to basically call this function each time that there is a new review or one is updated or deleted. Okay, so let's now start by writing that function, and for that, we're actually going to write a static method on our schema. And that's a feature of Mongoose that we hadn't used yet. So we only used instance method, which we can call on documents, and they're also very useful. But this time, we're really going to use static methods. Okay, so again, these can be called on the model directly, for example, like this, review.calc_stats, okay? And the way this works is, of course, review schema, and then .statics, and then the name of the function. So calc average ratings is equal to a function which, remember, takes in a tour ID. And that ID is, of course, for the tour to which the current review belongs to. And I know that at this point this probably all sounds kind of confusing, but don't worry, once we have all of this implemented, and also when we're testing it, it will then make a lot of sense in practice, okay? Anyway, in order to now actually do the calculation, we will again use the aggregation pipeline, right? So let's remember that in our tour controller, so right here, we use the aggregation pipeline to also create some statistics like this, okay? And so we used the aggregate method, which we called directly on the model, okay? And so now in our instance method, we can actually do the exact same thing. So in a static method like this, the this keyword actually points to the current model. And so that's why we can use this .aggregate, because remember, we need to call this aggregate on the model directly. And that's exactly why we're using a static method here in the first place. Because again, this now points to the model, and we need to call aggregate always on the model. Okay? So, into aggregate, we need to pass in an array of all the stages that we want in aggregate. Okay? So, what do we want to do first? Well, the first step should be to select all the reviews that actually belong to the current tour that was passed in as the argument. Okay? So, our first stage is a match stage. Remember that. And so in here we passed our filter object, and we can say tour equal to tour. But we don't really need that, as you already know, and so let's just remove this part. Or actually, just to make it a bit less confusing here with the names, let's call this one here tour ID. Okay, so tour ID then here. Okay, and so like this, we only select the tour that we actually want to update. Okay, now in the next stage, let's actually calculate the statistics themselves. And for that, we use a group stage. And in the group phase, remember the first field that we need to specify is the ID. So underscore ID, and then the common field that all of the documents have in common that we want to group by. And so that's again going to be the tour. So just like in our previous statistic calculation example, here we grouped by the difficulty. And so like this, we calculated statistics for easy and statistics for medium and then statistics for difficult tours. So in this example, we grouped all the tours together by their difficulty. Okay, but here, of course, we're grouping all the tours together by tour. Great. Now the number of ratings, remember how we do that? So all we do is to basically add 1 for each tour that we have. So each tour that was matched in the previous step. Okay? So if there are 5 review documents for the current tour, then for each of these documents, 1 will get added. And so then in the end, the number of ratings will be 5. And again, because of course we have 5 review documents. So that makes sense, right? And then also the average rating, which just like before, we use the average operator. And this needs to be inside an object. And then here, the name of the field, which is the rating, right? So remember how each review has a rating field. And so that's where we want to calculate the average from. Okay, and that's actually it. So number and average of ratings is exactly what we wanted to calculate in this aggregation. Now keep in mind that this actually returns a promise. And so we need to await that and then store it into a variable called stats. Okay, then mark this one here as async as well. Give it a save, and so now we actually need to use that stats variable. And for now, all I really want to do, just to test this, is to actually log the statistics to the console. So console.log stats. Okay, then in a later step, we will actually want to, as I mentioned before, then update the tour document with these statistics. But I'm going to leave that for a bit later. Because for now, we actually need to call this method here somewhere, because otherwise, these statistics here will never get called. And remember how we said in the beginning that we will do this using middleware each time that a new review is created. So let's implement that using review schema pre save. And then just our normal regular middleware function here. And remember that in this kind of middleware, the this keyword points to the document that is currently being saved. So this points to current review. Okay, and so we will want to call the calc average rating function using this.tour, right? Now, how are we actually going to call this function? Remember how I said that this function is available on the model. So basically like this, so review.calc average ratings. And then, as I said, we want to use this.tour. Okay, and again, because this is the current review, and this is then the tour ID that we're going to pass inside of the calc average ratings. Now the problem is that at this point here in the code, the review variable is not yet defined. Now you might think that a simple solution would be to simply move this code in here after this review declaration. But unfortunately, that's not going to work, because just like in Express, this code here basically runs in the sequence it is declared. And so if we were to put this code here after the review declaration, then this review schema here would not contain this middleware, because we would then only be declaring it after the review model was already created. Okay? But there's fortunately still a way around this, and that is to use this dot constructor. And so this here still points to the model. Now, basically, again, this is the current document, and the constructor is basically the model who created that document. And so this here stands for the tour, and so we can then simply do it like this. Then call next, as always, and that's actually it. And so let's now go ahead and test this. And for doing that, I will create a new tour first, because the other ones that we already have, they have the average and number of ratings already calculated. And so we really want to start from scratch here when testing this out. So to create a new tour, we need to be logged in as administrators, and I think we currently are. But just to make sure, let's do that again. Okay. So this is the new test tour. Let's remove these here. They are not mandatory. And I think with this, we're good to go. All right. And here you see the defaults that we set before. So the ratings average 4, 5, and the quantity set to 0. Okay. Now, in order to create a new review, we actually need to be logged in as a regular user, so not an administrator. And so let's get a normal user, let's say. So let's just use this Laura here. So laura@example.com. And as I mentioned earlier, the password is always the same. So let's do that. And now we will create new review on tour. And so now let's get the tour that we created earlier. So this ID, and put it here in the URL. Okay, and so remember that this route now automatically gets the tour ID from the URL and the user ID from the currently logged in user. Okay, so let's use this one as the first rating. Let's send it. And now I want to take a look at our console. And we have an output here, but for some reason it's only like this empty array. So something must not be working here. So let's take a look at the tour ID here, just to make sure that we're getting the right value here. ID. And let's also comment out this part here, just to see if maybe there's some error in this part. And so let's now try it again. And I will simply add the same one here again, okay? Okay, and so now we actually get something. So we have this one review, which is the one that we created initially. So it starts with this AC15, but the one that I just created is this 66D. Okay, so let's take a look at that here in Compass. And so we need to go to the last page. Okay, and so the one that shows up in our console is only this one here, but not the second one that we just created. Okay, and so if we now create a third one, then we should probably see the first and the second one. So let's try that. Okay, send this one. And now here in our output, actually get all three of them. So that doesn't make much sense. But anyway, the point that I wanted to make here is that we shouldn't use pre, but instead we should use the post save middleware. Okay, and that's because at pre-save, the current review is not really in the collection just yet. And so therefore, when we then do this match here, it shouldn't be able to then appear in the output here. Because again, at this point in time, it's not really saved into the collection just yet. Okay, and so it's best to use post here, because at that time, of course, all the documents are already saved in the database, And so that's then a great time to actually do this calculation with all the reviews already and then store that result on the tour. Okay, so I'm not really sure why this one here actually showed up at this point. But anyway, let's not try it with another one. So that's the fourth one. And now we get next is not a function. And indeed, as I mentioned earlier, the post middleware does not get access to next. And so therefore, we of course cannot call it, cannot use it. All right. And so here we have our next rating. Okay. And so indeed, it now shows up here as well. So we don't need that. And now we can safely try to calculate our statistics here. Give it a save. And actually, let's delete all of these reviews. So I basically want to start from scratch. Okay. So all of these 5 reviews here should go. And now we're ready to go. So let's actually create this one as the first one. And now let's go ahead and take a look at our statistics. And here we go. So this is the current tour ID. Then the number of ratings is 1 and the average is of course 3. So if we add another one with the rating of 5, well, then the average should be 4 and we should have the number of ratings equal to 2. So let's try that. And indeed, just as I said, 2 ratings, average of 4. And just another one, just to make really sure, let's add another one with 5. And here we go. Great. So we're now correctly calculating the statistics, but of course they're not yet being persisted to the current tour document. So if we come here in Compass to the tour that we just created, probably it's the last one here. Yeah, so our test tour, it still has these default values of 4.5 and 0, okay? And so now it's time to actually persist the calculated statistics into this tour document. Okay, and so let's do that. And first of all, in order to be able to do that, we need to require the tour model, right? So tour require, and there we go. So what we need to do is to basically find the current tour and then update it. So we did that before many times. Find by ID and update. Okay, and the ID is of course the tour ID that was passed into the function, and then an object of the data that we actually want to update. So let's get these field names from here. So we have ratings quantity. On one hand, let's put it here to 1 for now, just so we don't get an error, and the ratings average. Again, to prevent any errors, because now I want to come here and take a look at these statistics. So you see, they are stored in an array actually, okay? And so we need to go to the first position of that array, which is where this object is. So stats at position 0, and then from there we get the n rating property. Okay, so this one here. And then of course the same for average rating. Okay, and now we also need to await it. So as always, this returns a promise, and so we can await it. Now we could also store the result of this to a variable, but we don't really need the tour at all. All we want to do is to really update it, and so we do not store the resolved value of the promise anywhere. Okay, so let's simply try to add another review here, this time with 1, terrible. Okay, And first of all, let's take a look at the statistics. And so, of course, we get the rating of 4, so the number of ratings, and the average of 3.5. And so now, in order to really see if it worked, let's check out Compass. Or we can also use or get tour endpoint. Okay, and so we need the tour ID, which we can copy from here, paste it here, and now comes the moment. And indeed, it worked. Perfect. So that's awesome. Absolutely fantastic. Just one more time for the fun of it, let's add another review here. Okay, update this one. And so now we get 5 and our average went up by a little bit. Great. So let's now just take a second and recap what we did here. So we started by creating a static method. So this entire function here to basically create the statistics of the average and number of ratings for the tour ID for which the current review was created. Okay, and we created this function as a static method because we needed to call the aggregate function on the model. And so in a static method, this variable calls exactly to a method. And so it's very handy in these cases. So we constructed our aggregation pipeline here, where we selected all the reviews that matched the current tour ID, and then there calculated the statistics for all of these reviews. Then, after that was done, we saved the statistics to the current tour. Okay? And then, in order to actually use this function, we call it after a new review has been created. Okay? And for that, we need to use this .constructor because this is what points to the current model. Now keep in mind how we said that we also want to update the statistics whenever a review is edited or deleted, because these actions will of course also influence the number and the average. However, doing so is a bit more complex. And so since this video is already running pretty long, let's actually leave that to the next one.